Hopefully by now all of you have purchased some version of the textbook. I recommend that you get the newest edition, which is the 9th 2014 edition, just because this is a workbook, so you are going to be working through the exercises in the textbook, as well as this version also comes with flashcards that you can break up and use to help you study. Chapter 1 is really designed to help introduce you to the idea of medical language and kind of how the rest of the textbook is going to be broken down. So the things that are presented here are going to help you figure out how to put together medical terms and how to break them down and figure out what their meaning is. Throughout every chapter, you're going to find that the PowerPoints are broken down into sections, and each section starts off with an objective that kind of outlines what is going to be in that particular section. After chapter 1, all of the objectives throughout the chapters are pretty much the same. So each chapter is going to follow the same exact format. Therefore, after the first few chapters, you should get a feel for how the whole book is laid out and use that to help you study more effectively. This is a picture of the online resources that are available to you. I put the link right on the top of Moodle LMS just so that you have that for you. This is something that I would highly recommend you use throughout the semester. I actually have you go in and do games from each chapter as part of the online work you are to complete. This came with the textbook, however, I think it's pretty good. The games are just one option, but you can also get quick quizzes, help with pronunciations, reviewing activities on a chapter-by-chapter basis. You're going to use this for each chapter, but this is also going to come in real handy towards the end of the semester when we start to begin to review for the final. You'll notice in the upper right-hand corner, too, there's a tab for flashcards. So if you don't want to use the physical flashcards that came with your book, you can use the flashcard tab here as well. And therefore you can kind of break it down by chapter, you can put different chapters together. There's a whole bunch of different options. So you're going to be getting to know this and use this throughout the semester. This chapter is going to introduce you to medical vocabulary that comes from a variety of different places. I'd say the majority of medical terms that we're going to find come from Latin and Greek word parts. So it's kind of like learning a whole new language. And once we learn those parts, then we can combine them together and mix them together in different body systems to get the different words that we have in medical terminology. That's going to be the easiest category. We're also going to learn about 3 other categories: eponyms, acronyms, and modern language. And I'll explain what all those are in a few minutes. The ones that can be translated literally mostly come from those Greek and Latin word parts. The other categories, unfortunately, are going to have to most likely be straight up memorization on your part. So here are the 4 major categories. Again, Greek and Latin are terms that are built from word parts. So for example, arthritis is a word that is built from arthur, which means joint, and itis, which means inflammation. So when you put those 2 things together, you know that it's inflammation of a joint. And then we're going to see, for example, that same suffix throughout the year in terms of having inflammation of different body parts. Eponyms are a little bit different. They are derived from a person's name. So usually it's the person who discovered it, but it could also be someone famous who had the disease. So they give you the example of Alzheimer's disease was discovered by Aldous Alzheimer. But we also have things like Lou Gehrig's disease, or ALS, where it's gotten the name from a famous person who had that disease. An acronym is something that is a really long phrase where we take the first letter of each one of those words and we put it together just to make it easier to say. So one example is laser, which really stands for light amplification by stimulated emission of radiation. So we don't want to have to say that all the time. Therefore, we just say laser. The last category is how we have gotten away from using Greek and Latin word roots. It's more of an incorporation of the words that we use today. So that's modern language. So we think of things like nuclear medicine scanner. We didn't have, nuclear scanners back in the day of Greek and Latin times. So this is something that we have come up with in recent times. So eponyms, acronyms, and modern language are ones that you're really going to have to just kind of straight up memorize. They're not as easy to mix and match and put together as ones built from Latin and Greek word roots. Throughout these PowerPoints, I kind of mixed in some review questions that help you to review along the way as you're learning this material. So this one is talking about AIDS as an example of which one of those types of categories that I just mentioned. And hopefully you came up with B, an acronym. So we took the first letter of each one of the words and put it together, and that's how we got AIDS in place of acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. All chapters are going to have two major categories of words. Those that are built from word parts and those that are not built from word parts. The ones that are going to be coming from Greek and Latin word parts that we can mix and match to put together a bunch of different words. The ones not built from word parts are in those other three groupings, eponyms, acronyms, and then modern language. So they're not going to have a quick go-to in terms of memorizing. Those ones are going to be the hardest for you. In terms of your flashcards that you have, all of the word parts are going to be in your flashcards. But all of the words that don't come from word parts are not going to be in your flashcards. So if flashcards are something that help you, then that's something that you're going to have to make and create on your own for the ones that are not built from word parts. Here's a few more review questions. For example, Parkinson's disease is a term that you should think. B is not built from word parts. This is an example of an eponym based on the person who first described or discovered the disease. Whereas number 2, osteoarthritis, is built from word parts. So you should say A for that one. Osteo means bone. Arthur means joint, and itis means inflammation. So therefore, osteoarthritis, we would determine, means inflammation of the bone and joint. And don't feel bad if you're confused on what these parts are right now. We're going to actually learn them when we get to those specific chapters. This is one of those very important slides to pay attention to because it's going to reflect how word parts are for the entire rest of the book. The first type of word we're going to incorporate is a word root. Some of you have heard it as a root word. They both mean the same thing. But it's basically the core or backbone of the word. We can then add prefixes and suffixes onto these words to change the meaning. So prefixes go at the front, suffixes go at the back, but the idea is they just slightly change what that word root means. And the last category is a combining vowel, and most of the time it's an O. There's going to be a few exceptions that we point out along the way, but we usually add this vowel in just to help pronounce these really long, complicated medical terms. So we add it in between word roots, for example, or sometimes between a word root and a suffix to help it sound more smoothly when we say it. There are some general guidelines to follow when we actually figure out whether or not we want to incorporate a combining vowel. So number one, we do add in that O to help say things a little bit more smoothly when we have a suffix stuck onto the end of a word that doesn't already begin with a vowel. So here we have orthopathy. So we have Arthur, which is the word root, and we have pathy, which is the suffix. And because the suffix doesn't begin with a vowel already, we shove one in there to make the whole word sound a little easier. If the suffix already begins with a vowel, then we don't need to add in an extra vowel. So here we have hepatic. Hepat is the word root, ick is the suffix, and since ick already starts with an I, we don't need to add in an extra vowel. Rule number 3, we do stick a vowel usually if we have more than one word root. So sometimes we're talking about more than one body area or more than one issue within a condition, and we need to combine word roots together. So usually, even if there's some vowels in those word roots, we still put an extra one. So here we have osteoarthritis, and notice oste is one word root, Arthur is another, and Arthur starts with an A already, but we're still going to put that O in there just to make it sound a little easier. And lastly, for rule number 4, we do not use a combining vowel when we put a prefix with a word root. So regardless if the word root starts with a vowel or not, anytime we join a prefix with that word root, we don't use a combining vowel. So for example, subhepatic. Sub is the prefix, hepat is the word root. We do not use a combining vowel. So here's an example chart of a few different words you'll be encountering throughout the textbook that go into each one of those categories. So a few word roots you've already seen. Arthur means joint, hepat means liver, ven means vein, and oste means bone. Prefixes get shoved onto the beginning of a word, so maybe we want to say within the vein, so we would say intraven. Or maybe under the liver, for example, we'd say subhepat. So prefixes are really used to help give direction, and suffix usually gives you clues as to what the condition is. So if it's inflammation, then we would end it with itis, like arthritis. You're going to find that there's a lot of suffixes that mean pertaining to. So here we have ick and us. All of these pertaining to's can be used interchangeably. There's going to be a number of times where we have multiple words that mean the same thing, and they could be used interchangeably. We will find that there's one used commonly in medical practice, and that's the one that your book is going to go to, but that doesn't mean if you accidentally put the wrong one or put a different one that it's considered incorrect. So for example, if I said intravenous, that would mean pertaining to within a vein. But if I said intravenic, that means the same thing. It's just in medical practice we would normally say intravenous. And then the combining vowel, usually it's O. We are going to find a number of instances throughout the semester where it is an I, but usually when in doubt, it's an O. So the word part that is the core of a word, so this is the core, the major center or backbone. Hopefully you say C, the word root. Prefix goes at the beginning, suffix at the end, and sometimes we use a combining vowel. And it's important to know that not all medical words have both prefixes and suffixes or combining vowels. We're going to find instances where there might be none of those, one of them, or many of them. The combining form is what we're going to be seeing most often in the textbook, in the different tables and charts and things like that where you're actually introduced to the word parts, they're going to give it to you in this combining form. So it's a combination of the word root and whatever combining vowel is used with it. Again, most of the time the combining vowel is an O, but not always. So here, for example, Arthuro is the combining form, meaning that's what you're normally going to use when you put it together to form a larger word. Or hepato, or veno, or osteo. It's the combination of putting a word root together with its combining vowel. And if there is going to be something that's not an O, you would see it here with an I instead of an O. And again, this is how the words are going to most likely be presented to you in the textbook. And when we get to the testing situation and you have to kind of write out what certain words or word parts mean, you're going to be asked to write this combining form. So here's the beginning of just some general rules to keep in mind when we put our words together. In order to even create a medical term, there has to be at least one word root. You can't have a medical word without a core. Like I mentioned before, not all of them are going to have a prefix and a suffix or a combining vowel. There might be one or two or even none of these things. Combining vowels are used to connect word roots to other word roots, or word roots to a suffix that don't start with a vowel. And then that last point, if the suffix does start with a vowel, then we usually get to skip adding that additional vowel in. A key point here is when we have to actually define a medical term. So if you're given this big, long medical word, you might ask yourself, okay, where do I actually even start to figure out what it means? So usually what we do is we start at the end. So you figure out the last part of the word or the suffix, what does that mean? And then you go to the beginning and figure that out. So for example, osteoarthritis, we're going to start at the end with itis. And we know itis means inflammation. So now we have to figure out, okay, well, this is inflammation of what? So you go to the beginning of a word. Oste means bone, and arthur means joint. So now I know by breaking this down, osteoarthritis means inflammation of the bone and the joint. We don't always start at the end, but usually that's a good rule of thumb. So here's one of those exceptions to the rule where you don't really have to start at the end and then go back to the front, just because it's a very short, straightforward word. So here we have melanoma. So you could start at the end. Oma means tumor. Melon means black. So you could say tumor of black, and that would be correct. Or you could just read it front to back and say melanoma is a black tumor. Again, don't worry about having to memorize these word parts just yet. We're going to actually introduce them when we get to the specific chapters. So these are going to be introduced again when we get to the cancer unit or cancer chapter. This is just to kind of get you an idea of how words are put together. So a review question: if vowels are present at the junction of two word roots in a medical term, a combining vowel is usually... So what this means is if I'm putting things like Oste and Arthur together, do I need to add an extra vowel in between? And the answer is A, yes. Even if there is a vowel, anytime you join two word roots together, we usually still add that extra vowel. So this chart is in your textbook on page 14, and it kind of goes through and breaks down the different techniques to learn the medical terms. So they break it down into three major categories, analyzing the word, then defining the word, then building the word. So in analyzing, that's really you're given a word and you have to start to try to figure out what it means. And so the best thing to do is to first divide it into parts. So if you have this big long word, go ahead and put slashes to separate out the different word parts. So it's kind of been done in the top one for you. You don't necessarily always have to separate the word root from the combining vowel, but just to break it up so you can kind of help yourself figure out what each part means. They then suggest to label each part. So for example, asti is a word root, O is a combining vowel, so it gets a CV. Arthur is a word root, so it gets a WR. And then at the end of the word, pathy is a suffix, so it gets an S. And that's again to help you try to figure out what the word is actually going to mean. For number 3, they say label the combining form. You don't really have to do that. This whole step here is mostly for you to figure out what the word means. If you can do that any other way, go for it. In the second category, once you have it split up, then you can actually define it. And as mentioned before, start at the end with the suffix and then go back to the beginning. So in osteoarthropathy, pathy means disease. So you're going to be knowing that the definition is a disease of something. So then you go back to the beginning and say osteoarthro. Well, oste means bone and arthro means joint. So I know this word means disease of the bone in the joint. That's one way to go about doing it. In the last section, maybe I give you a definition and you actually have to come up with the medical term that means that. So to do this, again, the definition usually starts at the end. So if I say disease of the bone and joint, well, the first part I'm actually telling you what the suffix is or what the end of the word is. So you have to ask yourself, well, what is the suffix that means disease? And you say, oh, pathy. So you know that's the suffix. And then you ask yourself, what are the other key parts? Bone and joint. Well, I know bone is oste and joint is Arthur. So you can kind of write those in. The last part is to ask yourself, do I need to add in any of those combining vowels to make it sound easier? And the answer is yes, in actually 2 places. We always add that vowel in between 2 word roots. And then in this case, between the word root and the suffix, because the suffix does not start with a vowel. So that's how we end up with creating osteoarthropathy. So at this moment, I want you to see if you can just take some time, look at the table on page 11. There's a chart there that helps remind you of what different word parts mean. And I want you to see how many words you can actually create. There's probably at least 20 different words that you could create from this short list by putting together word roots and suffixes and adding some prefixes onto them. Just mixing and matching. Some of them might not seem like real words used in modern medicine. However, they could still be considered accurate and correct. So just take a moment and see how many of them you could actually build. This list of words goes along with exercise 15 in your book. So page 12, there's an exercise that gives you the word, and you have to write the definition on the line. This is something you're going to be seeing throughout all the chapters. That's going to be good practice for you, as well as something you might see directly on the final as well. So remember how we go about doing this. It kind of walks you through in the book. But you want to first break up the word into parts. So for example, arthritis, maybe you would put a slash between the R and the I to separate Arthur, the word root, from itis, the suffix. And once you've split it up, then go ahead and try to figure out what the definition is. So we start at the end, itis, and then go back to the beginning, Arthur. So arthritis means inflammation of the joint. I know this seems tedious now, but to get the gist of how this is broken down when we actually get to more specific body system words, it's going to be easier. So take a moment, work through exercise 15 in your book, and that will help give you an idea or some practice on how to do this. Another type of exercise you're going to see is like this. This one follows along with exercise 18 on page 13 of your book. So I'm giving you the definition here, and your job is to build the medical word that means that definition. And you'll notice when you look in the book that it's already kind of broken down into sections. So for example, inflammation of a joint, you have a line, and it's already split, so you know you need to have a word root and a suffix, and there is not going to be a combining vowel. This is another format you're going to be seeing throughout the textbook and on your tests, and really I think it's helpful because it gives you an idea of how many parts you need to include and gives you a heads up as to whether or not you think you actually need a vowel. So inflammation, I know, is itis. And our definitions always start with the suffix. So I'm going to put itis on the suffix line, and joint is Arthur. So I'm going to put that on the word root line. And because itis starts with a vowel, that's why I didn't need a combining vowel, and that's why you don't see it in number 1 on that exercise 18. So arthritis would be the word when you joined it all together. So take a moment and work through exercise 18.